cspan.org or tweet us at twitter.com/BookTV. More of BookTV's live coverage of the 2011 Harlem Book Fair now. Up next, a group of authors present their recent biographies and studies of African American history.
It's been said that Black Gotham challenges many of the so-called truths about African Americans. Expand on that.
They picked it up at the Harlem Book Fair and all that. Kind of picked up the book.
Okay.
Literary
Great.
Gotcha. And then they sent the book in for a review.
Welcome to the Harlem Book Fair's QBR panel discussions. I'm Cheryl Wills with New York One News, and I'm the author of Die Free, A Heroic Family Tale. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've been at New York One for 20 years. Can you believe New York One is celebrating 20 years next year? And the theme of today's panel discussion is triumph against the grain. And my book, Die Free, strongly identifies with that. I logged on to, believe it or not, 2 years ago, Ancestry.com, and found an amazing story of triumph against the grain. I learned from a website, not family lore, but from a website, that my great-great-great-grandfather was owned by Edmund Wills, a slave trader, hence my name, Cheryl Wills, and then he bonded with 5 boys on his slave plantation and escaped in 1863 to fight in the Civil War from 1863 to 1865. So I would call that the original triumph against the grain. And we have distinguished panelists who are also going to talk about their amazing books. And I'm going to ask you all to keep your introductions at first to about a minute as I introduce you, and then we will take it from there. First, let me introduce Dr. Carla Peterson. She's the author of Black Gotham, A Family History of African Americans in 19th Century New York City. She's a professor of English at the University of Maryland at College Park. Her expertise includes 19th century African American women writers and speakers in the northern U.S. Please welcome her. Dr. Gregory Jones is the author of Job, A Man for His Time. Dr. Jones is a graduate of Methodist College where he studied psychology and religion, a star athlete. He became an All-American and Player of the Year during his basketball career, and his number 21 jersey, for those of you who may recognize him, was inducted into his College Hall of Fame. Please give him a round of applause. Craig Williams is here. He is the author of The Olympian, An American Triumph. He's a New Jersey native, and he wore many hats before becoming a writer. At Syracuse University, he majored in business, but always held a deep fascination for the study of history. Please give him a hand. Dan Charnas is here, and he is the author of The Big Payback, The History of the Business of Hip-Hop. He's a journalist, screenwriter, record producer, teacher, one of the first writers for The Source, and part of a generation of young writers who helped create hip-hop journalism. Give him a hand. And lastly, Mark Johnson is here. He is the author of Basketball Slave, the Andy Johnson Harlem Globetrotter NBA story, and that is quite a title, I must say. Mark Johnson is the youngest son of Andy Johnson, a respected business professional and advocate for young people. He's a native of Philadelphia and graduate of the State University of New York at Old Westbury. Basketball Slave, his book, is filled to the brim with extraordinary tales about the story you never heard about the Harlem Globetrotters, and he's going to tell it from the perspective of his father. Give him a hand. Okay, let's start with Dr. Carla Peterson. It's been said that your book, Black Gotham, challenges many of the so-called truths about African American history. Expand on that.
Okay, so I wrote my book for a general public, and so what I'm going to say might be familiar to many of you, but I thought that it bore repeating in the beginning of the book. One is that when we say 19th century African Americans, we don't mean slaves in the South or only slaves in the South, but also free blacks in the North. The second would be that if we say New York State was for the Civil War, everybody would say, oh, a free state, when the fact is that emancipation did not occur in the state until 1827. Another would be that in New York in the 19th century meant Harlem. Harlem was a cow pasture at the time. And so what I'm talking about in my book is Lower Manhattan, which was a very mixed, which was filled with mixed neighborhoods. There were not segregated neighborhoods the way that we think of Harlem now, or at least in the early 20th century. And because of that, I think that blacks had a very different kind of experience than one would normally assume. And the last point is, of course, that out of this came a black elite. And they really were triumph against the grain. So my book is based on my family's history, the Guignons and then the Whites. All the research was done here at the Schomburg, 11 years worth of it. And I traced them and their friends, and they came from nothing. And they did well. They were doctors, they were pharmacists, they were in tobacco trade, they were in hairdressing and so forth. And so that's really the history of a black elite in New York that I try to uncover in the book.
Thank you. Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, you know, of all the stories in the Bible, the story of Job seems to stretch across generations, centuries. People always seem to resonate with the story of Job. Tell us why you wrote the book.
Well, I wrote that book, Cheryl. First of all, thank you for the marvelous introduction. You're probably expecting Michael Jordan or somebody, right? Well, listen, I'm humbled by it. But one thing that I found out while I was on the bed of affliction is that when you're in the midst of suffering, rather than try to reject it, try to remove it, try to tussle and wrestle with it, to try to fight with it, that you sometimes have to embrace it. And so I made a vow to the Lord that if you lift me up from this downward spiral that I was confronted with, that I would write this story on Job, so that people can look at Job not just about his patience. We always focus on his patience. But if we really look at this man's integrity and his character in the midst of the struggle, that we can use that in modern day. Because look at how the floodwaters are here today. Look how this world is ever changing. And people are committing suicide and making decisions that are contrary to the scriptures. But Job upheld the heavenly kingdom. He always looked up top for his answers and not below. So I wanted to write this story, Job, a man for his time, a man for our time, a man for all times. That this story should not just lay dormant in the Old Testament, but we need to resurrect it today. Because we don't need to internalize, we don't need to intellectualize, we don't need to politicize another person's suffering, because you take away from the essence of that person's suffering. So if we embrace suffering and look at the beauty that's within it, we then can get a different perspective of how God is in control of all things.
Very good. Looks like we can have church in here too today, right? All right.
Thank you.
John Baxter Taylor, Craig, is a name that may not be common to many people, but when he died in 1908 at the age of 26, the New York Times called him the world's greatest Negro runner. Tell us why so many of us have never heard of him.
I've actually given that quite a bit of thought, and I believe that his story, like many stories, exists in a cultural blind spot. Although I think it is a trend that is changing. For the largest part, we as African Americans have tended not to look back, to find our heroes, to explore those chapters of our story that contain a tremendous amount of pain. we tend to want to look forward. And of course, mainstream society, for the vast majority of our history here, have de-emphasized or undervalued our story. And so kind of like two baseball players in the outfield calling, "I got it, I got it, I got it," and then the ball falls between them, a lot of these stories, like John's story, just are existing in a space where nobody's looking. But I can assure you that this is one of many, many stories of triumph and overcoming obstacles that, in my heart of hearts, I know need to be told.
Wow. Dan, whether it's hip-hop, jazz, or rock and roll, the music business, we all know, can be a dirty business. Based on your book, The Big Payback, The History of the Business of Hip-Hop, how would you rank the business of that musical genre? Would you rank it as the best of the best or the worst of the worst?
Well, in terms of it being a business, and specifically a business of black culture that enfranchises the makers of that culture, I would say that it's by far the best.
Oh, really?
And that's what the book is about. You know, hip-hop became a multi-billion-dollar business. I think $1 billion a year in terms of the recorded music. I think that the clothing business was something like $2 billion a year at the time that my book ends, which is 2008. People forget what this was, 30 years before then, and where it came from. It came from here. It came from the streets of Harlem and the streets of the South Bronx. At a time when the odds were stacked against Harlem and the odds were stacked against the people who created this music. Harlem was deindustrialized. Jobs had left. In the 1960s, the biggest part of the Harlem economy was the numbers racket. And the entry-level job was numbered runner.
Wow.
And what happened, and also at the same time, the music industry was very much stacked against black music and black culture. It was more segregated than it had ever been. You had pop stations that wouldn't play black artists. MTV, which was just about to emerge, wouldn't play black artists until they were forced to in the Michael Jackson Thriller era. And even black-owned stations like WBLS, which was founded in the early part of the 1970s, were very, they had a lot of antipathy towards this music.
I remember that.
And this book is the story of not just the artists, but the people behind those now famous artists who made the famous, who fought behind the scenes. Some of them, like Sylvia Robinson, Russell Simmons, Fab Five Freddy, and on for a period of 40 years, from 1968 to 2008, to turn this street culture, which could have become nothing, into something. And that's the story that I wanted to tell in writing the book.
Okay. Mark Johnson, you are here on a very personal mission. You have written the story of your father, Andy Johnson, who was a Harlem Globetrotter, and you call it Basketball Slave. Now, when most of us, depending on your age, when we think of the Harlem Globetrotters, we think of Meadowlark Lemon spinning the football, and spinning the basketball. So I hate doing sports, okay? But I do my best, all right. Spinning the basketball on his finger and clowning around, and they all seemed happy. But you have called your book Basketball Slave when referring to the Harlem Globetrotters. Why?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here today so I can discuss one of these untold stories that's been mentioned before up here. Actually, what happened is the fact that my father was also one of the first blacks in the NBA also, played for Philadelphia. And uncovering this story, this was a story that was, again, where a lot of these gentlemen, they never said anything. They just took what they were put in front of them and just continued on life. And I called it Basketball Slave because it started with me fighting for a pension, the NBA, for my father's NBA pension. And he never really talked about his life in general, but I had to find out certain specifics about his life. And as I start going back, I started literally from when he was a little boy growing up in North Hollywood, California. And he told me, you know, Mark, he said, I never graduated. And I said, what do you mean you didn't graduate? I knew he was an All-American at the University of Portland. He said, no, well, I didn't graduate college, but I also didn't graduate high school. And I was dumbfounded. I said, well, wait a minute, how can you end up in a 4-year institution like the University of Portland without graduating high school? So I pulled his transcript, which I did put in the book, and lo and behold, on his college transcript, it literally said he did not graduate. Wow. And on his Portland transcript, it showed how the school had erased grades to keep him playing, because when he went there, this was at a time when not even a lot of blacks were allowed to attend large white colleges.
What year are we talking about?
We're talking about 1950. So when I saw this, you know, in my personal life, I worked as a director of the kids program, and I see how a lot of athletes, and I was an athlete myself, but nevertheless, I saw a lot of parallels on what was going on with my father in 1950 onto what's going on now in the 2000s and 2011. And you know, it's kind of sad because there's so many parallels that are still going on, because pretty much this is really supposed to be about education, but somehow it's all about sports, and it's all about being the number one. It's all about now getting paid. And unfortunately, my father was one of these guys, these pioneers, that never got paid, along with the Harlem Globetrotters and the NBA. And like you said, usually when you talk about the Harlem Globetrotters, they think about, everyone knows Mel Larkin Lemon and Curly Neal.
Right.
Well, they were the showmen of this phenomenal group of men. But what people fail to realize and understand is that in 1950, when the NBA was created, it was not fully open to black ball players. And like I tell people all the time, if these great black ball players couldn't go into the NBA, and I say All-Americans, number ones in their respective cities, where do you think they played? Well, they played with the Harlem Globetrotters, which was the only team that were allowed these black ball players to play. It's almost like they were the dream team of the 1950s. So, and on part of it, they had to put the personifications that they were just a bunch of clowns. But in essence, they were serious ball players.
Wow. And they were also pioneers.
Absolutely. They were pioneers in every sense of the word. I mean, here we're talking about a group of men traveling around the world. I mean, we've all heard all the other local stories, but these were the only group of black men that were traveling in the early 50s in Paris, South America, all over the world, spreading goodwill and cheer to all these people. And that's what really makes them pioneers.
But where does slave come from?
Well, the slave part comes from, everyone would think that these guys are making tons of money, traveling around the world, seeing the world. And yes, Abe Saperstein, the owner of the Trotters, yes, he did take them around the world. And yes, he showed them different places and that they would have never seen before. But unfortunately, they didn't get paid.
The Harlem Globetrotters did not get paid?
When I say they didn't get paid, for example, they not only played the team, the Washington Generals or opposing team that they were able to do the tricks, but they were really responsible for playing what they called the College All-Americans. And the College All-Americans, exactly what they were, a group of guys coming out from the #1 schools of the United States, playing against these Harlem Globetrotters. So for on tour, the College All-Americans were making more money than the Globetrotters were. And they were the traveling star attraction team. So in essence, they were treated as slaves for pay. If they ever talked back, they would just send another guy, send you home. Can you imagine not able to talk back at all and say, hey, you know, what about my money? You didn't pay me this week. He's talking too much, send him back. It was very easy because Abe Saperstein, the owner of the Trotters, had a monopoly on all the black ball players. Like I said, if they don't play for me, where you think you're going to play?
Wow. Carla Peterson, your book Black Gotham paints an incredible portrait of African Americans in New York City who were doctors, dentists, all professionals. My question is, how did they triumph against the grain? How did they make that transition from being slaves to being doctors and lawyers and so forth in such a short period of time? And contrast that with today, when we have people who sometimes they take a long time to make the transition from being, you know, on the lower economic scale to making the move higher.
Okay, it's a great question. I can describe it, and I'll try and get towards an explanation, which are always difficult to do. So just to set the groundwork, New York was an incredibly, a place filled with racial tension, prejudice, so forth, a number of race riots, all culminating in the 1862 draft riot, which I'm sure many of you know about. So, and the ideology of white supremacy was just in the air all the time. And it's not only from the South coming up, but it's in New York itself, so that a doctor, a man by the name of John Van Every, who's a doctor, comes out with these pamphlets about Negro inferiority and the Negro as a separate species. So that's the context in which my family and their friends came into being and grew up and actually succeeded. I would say that and another context, well, no, I'll start someplace else. One of the things, of course, is the idea of community. And the idea that from the very beginning, there were churches, mutual aid societies, and so forth. And you know that, who was it, Pat Buchanan, way back when, said something that we were a tangled, pathologically disorganized or something like that. But from the very beginning, African Americans from the late 18th century on were a very well organized group. I think the key to their success was education. And from Michael Lomax's talk this morning on, there's been incredible continuity in the terms of education, hard work, the panel on business, and so forth. So talking about untold stories, and what we don't know about is the 19th century origins of the emphasis on education, the emphasis on entrepreneurship. So that everything really started with education. There was a group of young black men who went to a school called the Mulberry Street School in Lower Manhattan, and there were about 10 or 12 of them who hung together as a group and egged each other on and came to prominence, and my great-great-grandfather was among them. And then another thing that I think is important, as I said before, blacks were mixed in with whites throughout Lower Manhattan. This had its advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages was that racism was thrown in your face on a daily basis. The advantages is that white entrepreneurs and businessmen could recognize black talent and really help you along. And that was the case of my great-great-great-grandfather, Peter Ray, who started out in 1811 as an errand boy for the Lorillard Tobacco Company. And by the time of his death in 1872, he was the superintendent of the new factory, Lorillard Factory, in Jersey City. And so the Lorillards had recognized his talent in recognizing good tobacco leaf and in making snuff, and had nurtured him.
Well, Ms. Peterson, let me ask you, why aren't these stories better well known? Why don't, when we think of blacks in New York, we think of the African burial ground where slaves are buried. We don't hear these kinds of stories. Why?
So that was a question that you had asked as well. One of the things that really interested me was in my family, among my family and their friends, this real desire to keep the stories alive, to commemorate, to write newspaper articles, to give celebratory dinners every year, to commemorate with monuments and so forth. And to me, there was a cutoff. There seemed to be a cutoff at the turn into the 20th century, at a point when every generation had actually been saying we're new Negroes, and yet somehow in the beginning of the 20th century that really kind of stuck. And there was this kind of forward look moment and the desire to leave the 19th century behind. The 19th century is old-fashioned. It was parochial. It had seen slavery in really hard times. So I think a little bit with the Harlem Renaissance, there was this desire to almost clean the slate, declare the new Negro, and to look forward.
Right, and last question for you. What did these elite do to help those who were still catching hell?
Okay.
There were plenty of them.
Yes, okay. So
Didn't mean to fluster you there.
This is what's known as racial uplift.
Right.
And in academia, it's a very vexed question, and many people like to see it as a very elitist phenomenon, where it's those who are on top, are willing to condescend and stoop down and help the masses. That's certainly true, but on the other hand, racial uplift applied to the elite itself. There was no point at which they said, well, we've reached nirvana and perfection, so we don't have to uplift ourselves. It's just those lowly people. There was this continued emphasis on self-development, a concept that Du Bois really articulates very well at the end of the century, the need to develop yourself, and that is a continual process. And the last thing that I'll say is that, and this is what reminds me somewhat of Job, is that all of this in the 19th century, which is maybe why some of this history is forgotten, takes place in a deeply Christian framework. The idea that through all this suffering, through all the pains, the affliction, the boils, whatever, God is on our side. And maybe that is what powered my family and their relatives in the 19th century, and maybe that's not here today. I don't know, but that was a powerful motivator. God is on our side. We are suffering for a reason, but we will triumph.
And Dr. Jones, God was on Job's side. Why don't we, when we go through crises, why as a society are we not able to have that faith of Job? We read in the headlines every day about how people sell each other out, how people do despicable things to one another. No faith at all in the system, in God. Why hasn't that message translated to our present society?
Well, if you see from all of my distinguished colleagues here, struggle is paramount within everything they're trying to achieve. You look at Job, we always talk about his patience. But I propose this question: was he really patient? While in the midst of the struggle, Job said, I wished I'd never been born. I wish light had never come upon my birth. Does that sound like a guy who was patient? But we must take a deeper introspection of the situation. When adversity comes to us, we want to say, go next door. Cheryl looks great. Go to her house. Go to Craig's house. Don't stop here. But if anniversary knocks on the door, we're ready to open the door and have a party. What I found out, instead of asking the question, why me? Why not me? Because in the midst of the struggle, you learn something about yourself as you fight, as you tussle, as you wrestle with that situation. Job, as he navigated along, he reached a certain point where he kept questioning, God, I want to ask you some questions. Because we always want to go back to the way it was, when I was great, when I was at All-American, when I was on top. We always want to go back to there. But God has a greater purpose for us. King Solomon said, we must become skillful in dealing with things in this world. But in order to become skillful, we don't have to conform to this world. We just have to take a heavenly perspective. Now, as Job continued to move along, to navigate through those smothering ashes of despair, he reached a point where he said, although you slay me, I'm going to trust in thee. And this is what the perspective we have to do today. We can't give up. We can't quit. And we have to do like Apostle Paul emphasized, run that race to win. When I was in the midst of what I was dealing with my sickness, the doctor said I wouldn't make it by morning. I then had to take a deeper introspection of myself. We sometimes want to focus on what sin did I do to get in this situation. Look at Job. God said he was perfect, upright, escheweth evil. I mean, he avoided evil on every corner, and he feared God. Here was a righteous man put to the test. So I began to develop the 4 T's of life. You're going to go through a test. There's going to be a trial. There's going to be tribulations. But folks, let me encourage you today and inspire you. You can triumph over it all. You don't have to quit. So I feel the story of Job is paramount for today, because the only thing you have, folks, is your integrity and your character. And if you keep a heavenly perspective, you can't lose. Because we have to remember one thing, Cheryl, God is in control.
That's the truth.
When you're in the midst of the struggle, sometimes we want to rely on self. I want to rely on my athletic training, but I found out it wasn't superior to God. And when I look at my athletic training, as you listen to these gentlemen's story here, everybody was going through a struggle, but they kept that heavenly perspective. And we must embrace that heavenly perspective today more than ever, folks, because Satan is alive and well, and he's doing his job, but we don't have to kneel to him because he's already defeated, Cheryl.
Okay, Deacon Jones. Craig, how did John Baxter Taylor deal with those problems that he was faced with at the turn of the century?
My research indicated that John Taylor was a mild-mannered individual. It has to be remembered that this is somebody who was a first-generation free African-American living in the Progressive Era. His parents were born slaves. You know, this was a time in history where to be a second-class citizen as an African-American would have been a good day. And he emerged through good fortune. His father, although born into those circumstances, became an entrepreneur and was able to provide a middle-class lifestyle, which was extremely unusual for a black family in America. He attended the best schools. He emerged as an athlete at Central High School and then went on to Brown Prep, which is a school that no longer exists, but he gained national notoriety there, anchoring an undefeated relay team. And then he went on to the University of Pennsylvania, first admitted into the Wharton program, but then ultimately graduated as a doctor of veterinary medicine. And this is somebody who managed to navigate through all of these institutions and these various scenarios without a tremendous amount of confrontation and conflict.
How did he manage to do that at the turn of the 20th century when so many others were having a hard time? So many other African Americans were having a hard time.
I think that's one of the most intriguing aspects of this personality, because he defies expectations.
Right.
You know, this is a moment in history where you would absolutely not expect a young African American male to excel both academically and athletically. I mean, and you know, we take for granted these days that sports is kind of a natural thing for people of color. But at the time, he was a rarity in track and field as well. So this is somebody who managed to stand out and fit in. And I have to think that it was his Christian upbringing, as well as the force of his character and his talent, his God-given talents, that allowed him to transcend the situation and really defy the circumstances that black people faced at the time.
Oh. Hey, Dan, we all hear about hip-hop stars, and we all hear about how they sometimes go from kids in the hood with a dope rhyme, they shoot to fame, and they get a round-trip ticket right back to where they started. How is it that they lose all this money? Some of them, not all of them, obviously, but some of them famously so, lose everything. And when you interview them, the first thing they'll say is, my music company robbed me.
Well, I guess we'd have to talk about who, specifically who we're
I don't want to
speaking
name
of.
names, but I think some of the stories are very famous. Oh, you've never heard of such a story?
Well, a lot of artists will just say that. I mean, it's true in many senses, but it's not true in others.
Really?
The stories that I focus on are the stories of the folks who won the game and
But
how
what
they
about the
won.
ones who lost? Because those are the ones that we hear about, the tragic stories of the guys who make music and they tell people, I'm not getting a dime of that. Their music is being stolen, their rhymes are being stolen, their stuff is in commercials, and they're not getting a dime.
Right. Well, here's why it happens. And here's why hip-hop changed the game a little bit. Because I actually think it was worse in the age of R&B, and even worse than that in the jazz age.
Sure.
It's about ownership. It's about really not giving away your power, not giving away your capital, your intellectual capital.
But you know, a 16-year-old doesn't know that.
That's right. A 16-year-old doesn't know that. And a lot of folks had to get burned before they made decisions that were profitable for them. So for the folks who, let's talk about Run DMC, right? So Run DMC, no major label was ever going to give them a deal. So they got a deal with a small record label in New York, a disco label really, called Profile Records. And Profile gave them what was a standard deal that they would give any artist that was coming to them begging for a deal. They made about 71 cents a record. And after they started selling millions of records, they continued to earn at that rate. So Russell Simmons, their manager and the brother of Joe Simmons, a.k.a. Run, he came in Profile to try to renegotiate that contract, and Profile refused. And they got into a long, drawn-out legal battle that basically stopped Run DMC's career straight in its tracks. And Russell had to learn from that in the deals that he did later on. And it's one of the things that contributed to Russell's ability to do better for himself as a businessman. But Run DMC really never recovered from that as recording artists. Fortunately, they were able to go on and continue to earn as live musicians, but they were never able to get back on the train as it moved forward, the musical train, the cultural train as it moved forward.
Wow. Why was there so much resistance to hip-hop when it first came out? Like you said, and you were very accurate, MTV wouldn't play it. I mean, these guys and girls were superstars in the community, like here in Brooklyn, inner cities all across the country. MTV wouldn't play them. Why was that?
Well, part of it is white supremacy. The music business was incredibly segregated at the time, and
in the 80s.
In the 80s, that's right.
We're talking about the 80s.
Well, for instance, you could have an artist, I don't know how many of you remember Sherelle? Okay.
Yeah.
So she had a song called I Didn't Mean to Turn You On. It was big on all the black stations across America. It went top 10 on the R&B charts. But pop stations listened to that record and they said, well, we can't play this. It's too black, they said. They could say that, actually, and not go to jail. And a British rock star named Robert Palmer came and remade that song about a year later, and suddenly the pop stations that wouldn't listen to Sherelle made Robert Palmer go, I think, to number 2 on the pop charts. That was 1983, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, the same year I think that Michael Jackson was first starting to make inroads on MTV. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it, unfortunately, was a bit of a generational war between what you might call the civil rights generation and the hip-hop generation. And I think that there were folks who, the background of this is that there were independent black businesses in the 1960s that promoted and distributed R&B. There were independent radio stations, but a lot of them got bought up by corporations in the 1970s. Suddenly, the place for the black music executive was working for these larger corporations. They had bought into that system. And buying into that system meant going to work in the suit, and participating in this crossover business where you have your artists and you try to have them sweeten it up, lighten it up a little bit,
Right.
so maybe the pop stations will play it. And hip-hop was, you know, what they called rap music at the time. It was the antithesis of that. It was street. It was everything that these, you know, guys had basically been trying to get away from in their professional lives for various reasons, and not unfairly. You know, I don't want to be unfair to them, but you know, that's why Run DMC couldn't get a deal at Columbia Records. It took Run DMC's success for Columbia Records to finally turn around and say, Russell, we think you're very smart. We'd like to do a deal with you. But Russell never dressed up to go to any of those meetings. Russell came the way he always came, in his sneakers, in his jeans, in his Argyle sweater, and still does to this day. And what hip-hop represented was, we're coming as us. And we're not going to change our music for mainstream consumption. And as a matter of fact, history shows that the mainstream likes our music. We don't have to change it. And they ended up being right.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Tell me about the origin of your love of hip-hop. Were you raised in the hood?
I grew up in a pretty interesting place called Columbia, Maryland, which is about halfway between Baltimore and Washington. Now, some of you know a little bit about Baltimore and Washington and what those cities are like. And so suburban Maryland was a very interesting place, I think, for lots of kids to grow up, but no more so than a place called Columbia, because Columbia was pretty, for a suburb in the 1970s, pretty integrated along class and racial lines. So, like lots of suburban kids, I grew up listening to, you know, pop music, but you know, I also listened to WHUR, Howard University Radio, and I listened to.
And that's how your love of hip hop developed.
Right. But I wasn't the only one. You know, there was a lot of others.
Oh, we know you weren't the only one.
Yeah.
We know there's a whole lot of you in the closet listening to hip hop.
That's right.
Let me ask you this, Dan. Jay-Z, Sean Combs, 50 Cent, Russell Simmons. They've spun their hip-hop careers into zillionaires. They have clothing lines, they have music, they have alcohol named for them, you name it. Why do you only have a handful of these hip-hop artists that were able to do this, especially Jay-Z? What is the secret to Jay-Z's astronomical success, and why was he able to do it versus all the other guys who some may argue were more talented than him?
Right. Well, a lot of it has to do, you know, Jay-Z has two minds. He has his artistic mind, and he also has a business mind, right? He has the soul of an artist and the, you know, the mind of a killer. Like, and that's what in capitalism, that's what it is. I mean, you have to be a shark. And you know, part of Jay-Z's success had to do with a guy named Dame Dash, who is a native of Harlem, who in many ways taught Jay-Z about business. Dame had this sense of entitlement. He says that I am going to own stuff. I'm not going to sell it out. I'm going to put my name on it. The famous story is very early on in Jay-Z's career, they go to this jeans company. I think it was Iceberg Jeans. And they said, well, we would like an endorsement deal. And Iceberg Jeans says, well, Jay-Z is not the kind of artist that we want to be involved with. And so Dame says, okay, fine. I'll tell you what. I'm going to start my own clothing company. I'm going to put you out of business. And that was Rocawear.
Wow.
And long after, you know, thereafter, when, you know, Dame and Jay parted ways, that company, Rocawear, became Jay-Z's retirement plan, basically. But it was Dame's sense of entitlement and Dame's business sense, I think, that rubbed off a bit on Jay-Z. And, you know, when Rocawear sold, when their record company, Rockefeller, sold, it sold for $20 million. 2 years later, the clothing company sold for $200 million.
Wow. Is it still hot, Rocawear?
Rocawear?
Yeah.
Some would say not as hot as before, but
Yeah.
it's still there.
Okay, Dan, thank you. Before I go to you, Mark, if you have questions for our wonderful panel, we're going to ask that you line up. We have a microphone there. It's your opportunity to get on national television, C-SPAN's BookTV. While you prepare your questions, please line up to get your chance. And Mark, again, your book is called Basketball Slave. Your dad was one of the first in the NBA, correct?
That's correct.
What would he think about his time in the NBA, where I'm assuming he probably made pennies, versus now, where NBA players are making so much money, hundreds of millions of dollars? What would he think about this now? Would he be pleased, or would he say, sheesh, I wish that was me?
Well, you know, I think he would say, like a lot of these guys say, is that they feel as though they came along at the wrong time in their careers. I've never heard them down any, and when I talk about them, I'm talking about all of the pre-60 Globetrotters that played before 1960, and my father's included in that, where they love to see people and young guys get the opportunity to, number one, show their talents, because it was a thing where it wasn't only just money, it was talent.
Right.
Let's look back a little bit. Whenever anybody watches NBA TV or ESPN, they always flash back, and they flash back to Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell. But that's the only people they really flash back to.
Right.
Those guys didn't come in the league until closer to 1960.
Wow.
So what happens to these guys that played, between 1950 and 1960? All of these guys, there weren't a lot of them. It was just a handful. But the guys that were allowed to play, they weren't allowed to play their games. They weren't allowed to score. I remember my father telling me one time that he was not allowed to score the ball. I'm like, what do you mean? I thought that was the name of the game. But let's look back in the time. All the franchise players in between 1950 and 1960 were white.
How much did your dad make when he joined the NBA?
$6,000.
Wow. Do you think these NBA stars today, with all their bling and commercials and endorsements, are grateful for people like Andy Johnson?
I don't think they are, because they don't know.
How could they not know?
This story's not out here. I mean, for example, even my book, this was a self-published project, but it's just a matter of getting it one person at a time. It's the masses don't know about what these Harlem Globetrotters who traveled around the world making $200 to $300 a month, playing every day, sometimes 2 times, 3 times a day, even on Sunday. I have as I travel around, I show a schedule in 1955 where the Globetrotters left May 22nd and they came back August 22nd, and there was not one day they had off. And we're talking about traveling Belgrade, Leningrad, Switzerland, Europe, nonstop on a daily basis.
Did you try to reach out to any current NBA players for your book?
I have. I've gone the circuit. I've gone to NBA All-Star, but it's a matter of really being able to sit down and explain what went on. I mean, some guys are really up here now where you feel as though we know about the history, but they really don't know about the history. They have no idea.
Do you think they even care with all their money? Oh, the audience said no. Okay, we're going to turn to our guest, Olumide of Harlem.
Hi, my name is Olumide of Olumide Productions. Great panel, and again, Cheryl, continued success with the book.
Thank you.
I just want to first of all state that this is great that we're having this discussion where we're in a period now where people act as if we can't discuss race and it's no longer important. We've progressed from that, and that people are trying to cut black studies across the nation. We really need to have these discussions. It's a great venue. I want to commend you for that. When you discussed the music industry, it really piqued my interest. I wanted to know, do you really think that we've progressed that much in music? I remember MTV, they wouldn't show rap videos, but they would show the Beastie Boys. They wouldn't show Fishbone, but they had Red Hot Chili Peppers on there.
That's right.
And now you have people to this day who hate rap music, but, oh, Eminem, he's a genius. He's the best rapper in the world. Do we really think we've passed that Elvis mentality where we have to have white artists co-opt black culture and it's only legitimate then?
That's a good question.
I guess that question's for me.
Elvis mentality. You better coin that phrase. Damn.
I mean, I would answer your question yes and no. I mean, in some ways we have, in some ways we haven't. It's not an easy question to answer. It's very easy to point at Eminem and say, well, people think he's a genius and he sells a whole, tens of millions of records, but Jay-Z's a bigger artist than Eminem is. So in many ways, in the early R&B era, where you could have all these black R&B artists toiling in obscurity, and then Elvis coming in and just being everything. In the hip-hop era, it didn't go down quite like that. The stage is shared, and yes, I do think Eminem, one of the reasons Eminem is so huge is because of white privilege. But at the same time, I think that you have a generation that knows what this music is and where it came from, and that most white kids who have an Eminem poster on their wall probably also like Jay-Z and may have a Jay-Z poster on their wall. So it's not cut and dry. We are not in any kind of post-racial era, and we won't be in a post-racial era until we can actually be comfortable with not being in a post-racial era. Do you know what I'm saying? Like you said, until we can talk about race and be comfortable with the multiracial and multicultural character of our country, we won't, there's no post.
Okay, our next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Cecilia Falls, and I am working with an author, Margaret Wilkerson, who's working on a biography of Lorraine Hansberry. And this is more of a writing and research question for everyone on the panel. I just wanted to know what your writing process was like and how you went about getting your information and putting it together. And maybe some of the, I know for me, it's been amazing to be a part of this kind of process and looking at how things that you look for just kind of come to you sometimes when you didn't expect it. And I also wondered if you had situations like that.
Carla, why don't you talk about the writing
sure.
process?
That was my biggest challenge. So it took me 11 years to write this book, and a lot of it was because of the writing and not so much the research. The research was difficult in and of itself. I started about 1795 and I end in 1895. So we're talking about a long time ago. Much of the research I did at the Schomburg, and I'm eternally grateful to the Schomburg, because in fact, this building holds my family's history, so that was really wonderful. So I decided to write about the 19th century. I was really interested in Northern Black culture generally, before the Civil War, but I wanted to write a book for a general audience, and I decided family was a good hook, because everybody's got a family, whether you know who they are or not. And when I started, and this is on the very first page of my book, I come to the Schomburg, and I go upstairs and I check everything, and I face the librarians, so they make sure I won't steal anything. And I start digging, and people say, you're not going to find anything. It's a needle in a haystack, and I find. So when I first thought about doing the book, because I'm an academic, and actually I'm in an English department, but it was going to be a kind of more of an institutional history, and just where I found my family memories, I would plug them in, right? And I actually had an agent who was like, no, that's not going to work. And so the driving force of my book it's like a detective story. I start with one name, that of my great-grandfather, Philip Augustus White, and a full story about him. And it's not helpful to have an ancestor whose name is White. Basically... Wait,
I'm sorry, why?
White? Because you go into a database and you put in White, everything comes up.
Okay.
Everything comes up.
I didn't know if that was a loaded answer there. I mean, I got you. Mark Johnson, what was your writing process?
My writing process was literally just one page at a time.
Did your father leave you lots of documentation?
He left me some, but a lot of it I had to go out and research on my own to get. I had access because of who my father was. I had access to certain people, which helped tremendously. The other thing is that when I first started the book, it was more or less it was something I felt as though I had to do, not only for my father, but for all these other men that have really lost their voice along the way.
Right.
So that was the two things that really kept me motivated. And unfortunately, I lost my father halfway through this project, so I knew I had to finish it.
Yeah, you did it for
in
him.
his honor.
You did it for him. Dan, what was your writing process? You had a lot of volume to deal
Yes,
with.
660 pages, a
Yeah.
lot of late nights, 4 years, over 300 interviews, and many cups of coffee, and not without the complete support of my lovely wife, Dr. Wendy S. Walters, who took care of our child many nights while I was in the library over at Columbia writing.
Well, Dan, let me ask you this. What position do you take ultimately? That of the big cats or the struggling hip-hop artists? Who do you side more with in this book?
This book follows the small guys who became big guys.
So who do you identify more with? Who are you feeling more? Who do you have empathy for?
I don't know. I just don't. I don't look at it that way. I mean, you know, Russell Simmons is a big guy, but he started from nothing. I mean, he came from Hollis. He came from a lower middle class family. His father worked for the city. I think his mother might have worked for the city as well. You know, he saw an opportunity and he took it. He bet on himself. He bet on this culture. He didn't sell out until he actually did sell out. You know, many years later when he sold his businesses. But you know, many people could look at somebody like Russell or somebody in Jay-Z and say they have everything, but they came from nothing.
They did struggle.
Could you continue with the last
Can we
two
go to
people?
the next question, sweetie? We can't ask. We got a limited time. I'm sorry. If you don't mind. Time is not on our side. But thank you. Don't take it personal, honey. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Shala, and right now I'm writing a book about hip-hop. And when I hear from Dan, in many ways, I feel like he's missing the concept of really understanding the destruction of hip-hop. I see hip-hop in many ways is being destroyed by capitalism and white superior power. And I feel in many ways, when I see him in many ways, he can't understand hip-hop. He failed to understand what's really going on. Jay-Z sold out. He may have specific power, but it's limited power because he's controlled by a bigger force. And something about hip-hop, as black people, we gotta take control of our power. We gotta stop allowing others to destroy we gotta stop allowing others to destroy and carry out destiny. He can do all the research he wants, but he failed to understand hip-hop because growing up in the middle of D.C., middle of Baltimore, he really understand what hip-hop really means. Thank you for your time.
Dan, what's your response to that?
I mean, I could see what you're saying. Hip-hop isn't what it was because it did get embraced by capitalism. And capitalism in America changes everything. It defaces everything, but I mean, hip-hop is as much a victim of that as anything else. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, people like to blame hip-hop for misogyny and violence and materialism, but all of those things are products of America. And as any subculture becomes mainstream, it's going to adopt those American values. It just offends me when people sort of put those on hip-hop as if hip-hop invented them, when America invented them. And really, you know.
Safe?
Oh, thank you for having me. I have a lot of questions.
We can only do one, my friend.
It's for the sister right there. I'm beside you with the book.
Peterson.
Yes, ma'am. She was saying that the black origin of New York City was downtown Manhattan. And how do you feel about like people giving ownership to Harlem now, saying that their neighborhood is being taken over by gentrification and things of that nature? Do you feel that we should go back downtown where we were originally from? Okay. Tribeca? Okay. I'm from Harlem, by the way, right across the street, 135th, all boroughs, 4 Green represent.
Okay.
I think you should buy property wherever you can, basically. So I wrote a little article that's supposed to come out in the Daily Beast, and they've been promising it for months, and it hasn't. But it's titled something like "What's Black New York?" And the point that I make there is Harlem as we know it, i.e. of the first half of the 20th century, has created its own myth. of black people living in a really in a very dense segregated area where they live and work and play together, community institutions and so forth. And yet before that, and now I would say now, blacks are spread all over the city. Yes, gentrification is happening here. Harlem is becoming more integrated, which is what it was, well, not before, but which Lower Manhattan was before. And populations like in Brooklyn, areas of Brooklyn, Queens, et cetera, are increasing in the black population. So that one of the things I think is that the Harlem model, which is a great model, but it doesn't represent black New York. The model that we think of as the black Mecca of, say, the first half of the 20th century. What do I think? I honestly don't know. I don't know. People should be able to live where they want, and that would be an optimum with the money they have and so forth. I'm not a sociologist. I can't pretend to say where I think people should live.
Next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Jabril, and I'm also from Harlem. And my question is to the two gentlemen to the left. When I think of your book, The Basketball Slaves, it just reminds me of what's going on now with basketball. And there's currently what is it called? The word I'm looking for. It's a lockout. It's a lockout that's currently taking place. But it's not too much ownership on the player's side. But it also makes me think of just the music industry. There's only about 4 major record companies. That's Universal, that's Warner, E1, and there's another one, Sony. But there's not too much ownership in that as well, just within the black community in general. So I'm wondering, how can we move towards that angle? And it seems like even in the music industry, even though I know your book is a big payback, it seems like a lot of the artists themselves are still slaves in that sense, how he puts it in his book, as far as when you compare it to the NBA. But how can we move towards getting around that?
So Mark, why don't you hit that first?
Well, I think one of the main ways we can do that is getting this history out on both of these books. I mean, ownership is, and that's what slavery is built on. Ownership and making that other person work, do whatever you want them to do for a minimum amount of money or no money at all, or what they deserve to really be getting paid. So we have to, number one, know that there's history behind both sports and music, and we now, like Jay-Z and all these other guys, well, like I said, start towards ownership of what we're doing. I mean, people got mad at LeBron James when he walked away from Cleveland, but what he did was he walked away from his owner, because there was a sense of ownership that they had while he was playing there. It's up to him if he's able to move as a free agent to Miami, LA, wherever. That should be his choice. But what happened is that because we're so used to people owning everything, then we're settling. And that's one of the problems now, that a lot of these so-called millionaires are fighting the billionaires. They're just millionaires. They're not the billionaires, and they're not the owners. And you can count, like you said, there's 4. Well, I would ask you to count how many minorities own sports franchises.
How many?
1.
Wow.
It's Bob Johnson.
That's right, Charlotte.
Right.
And to take that lockout metaphor into this, the only reason hip-hop happened is because of a lockout, right? Hip-hop was locked out of the clubs, locked out of the radio stations, locked out of the record stores, locked out of the record companies. So that's why all these guys could create their own companies. And that lockout really continued into the mid-90s. That's when corporations started turning around saying, hey, well, maybe we can do business, right? So what has happened now is you've had a few of these guys able to really, really run it up into, make their net worth into the almost a $500 million range. And most of them sold those companies that they created. The fear I have for the future is that your Kanyes, your Drakes, your Waynes, the people who, Nicki Minaj, the people who are at the head of the game now, they don't have entrepreneur mind because now they have more mainstream access. They go right on to pop radio because hip-hop is treated as pop now. But it's because of the work that those entrepreneurs did over 30 years to make that so. But what happens when you don't have independent institutions? What happens when the only institutions that are making those decisions are those mainstream institutions? The sad fact that you allude to is that black capitalism, as it turns out, is not black nationalism. Black capitalism is to aggrandize a few black capitalists. The only way you turn black capitalism into black nationalism is to retain ownership, to expand. And that's hard in this society, in capitalism, because all capitalists eventually sell, go public. You know, that's what it is. So it is a very, very long and somewhat sad tale.
Thanks, Dan. Next question.
Thank you very much. My name is Marilyn May, and I want to thank you and note that 3 of the panelists mentioned, Christian upbringing as a factor in the success of your family, and I want to, acknowledge that, because I think we often forget how important that faith has been to the success stories of all the people of many of the people that you talked about. And I'm a wannabe author, and I recently did a book called Stone of Help, which is at stoneofhelpharlem.org, and it's about my church here in Harlem, where I grew up. And the church was founded in 1911, and I wrote the book, and I self-published it using Amazon's Create Space. And my question is about this idea of getting your story out when you're not in, when you want to own your own story. It's the publishing version of what you've been just talking about with the music industry and with the sports industry. I want you to talk to me about the publishing side. We have stories we want to tell. I have stories I want to tell. I don't have a platform. I'm not T.D. Jakes. I can't get on TV. So I don't have a platform. That's what they tell me. I need a platform. Can you give advice to people who want to tell their stories?
Okay.
And
Dr. Jones.
And self-publishing.
Great. Good question.
Okay. I self-published my book.
Okay.
And this was a 10-year piece of work, of dedicated work, sacrifice, and prayer and meditation. Everybody's story is different, but you have to be, in a capitalistic society, you have to be very aggressive. You have to do your research, you have to do your homework. You can make it. With all the modern technology out here today, you can focus in on those things. Twitter, Facebook, setting up your own website, and also using the connections that you've made over your lifetime and say, hey, I've written a book. But you have to be motivated to go out here. Like right now, my wife and I are on a 66-city tour. We self-finance. We self-financed our tour. I wanted to self-publish my book. And most times when you're a writer like us up here and the big companies don't want to take you on, that's all part of the capitalistic structure. You don't have to fall prey to that. Okay. It depends on your heart. What has God put in your heart for you to be and to become? Because He opens the doors, not man. And one more point I want to make to you. I spent a career in banking, in the upper echelon part of banking, okay? Not on the lower level. And I've heard all these men here talk about the capitalistic thing and slavery and all things. I want to say to you today, I'm glad I'm the descendant of slavery. I'm glad. I'm proud of it. And folks, but I felt the deepest form of slaveocracy that I had to face was my father. That man was tough. He was rigid. He was unyielding. And he was a very successful businessman. Even my grandfather, the Honorable Reverend Pompey J. Jones, very successful man. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, and Durham was called at that time the Black Wall Street. We own our own pharmacies, Mechanics and Farmers Bank. You're talking about the mutual life insurance, mutual savings and loan. I grew up around black doctors and their people being successful. So what I'm saying, I'm glad to hear about these hip hop guys out here doing their thing, all the great jazz artists. But what, folks, I want to focus on one thing today. You can be whatever you want to be, but you don't have to rely, and I hear this a lot of times, people are like, maybe the Caucasian sector is holding me back. Satan is holding me back. If you discipline yourself, if you get the knowledge, you can be as successful as you want to be. The foundation of anything in life is to get a good education. You've got to get a good education. too many, if I may, too many people, black folks, think dropping out of school is the right thing to do. That's not the right thing to do, folks. Too many people paid a heavy price with their life for us to get an education. So what I'm saying to you today, you may say we don't own sports franchises, but let me tell you as a banker, is really owning a sports franchise the best investment? Think about it. You see all the billionaires that own sports franchises? It's a second or third thing that they do. Wow. It's almost like a certain comfort, you know, a certain gamesmanship. See, we have to focus on what is the desires that God wants you to be. And this is what I want to tell you. Folks, we were a slave for sin, right? We lived in sin. But one man came to give us that blessed hope. And if we keep that focus up high, I'm telling you today, I'm a prime example. I came up in the tough 60s. I helped integrate schools down in the South. I was small. I want Martin Luther King, but he set an example for all of us to follow. And you can't rely, this is no disrespect for certain people in academia, but folks, you have to get your knowledge. Because sometimes academia will put research out there to restrict you, to make you think things that you don't need to think. You keep a heavenly perspective, I can assure you today, God has doors open for you that you can't even imagine. And you don't have to come up and say, a Caucasian sector is holding me back. Capitalism is holding you back. Because remember, folks, and I'm going to tell you this today, there's only one economy, the economy of God.
Okay, Dr. Jones. All right, we're going to take an offering now. We're going to pass the plate. Pass the hat. I got time for one more question. I have 2 minutes. Janet.
Yes, my name is Janet Banks. I'm happy to be here.
I got 2 minutes, Janet.
The panel have been inspirational to me. My question is, after being a teacher for 50 years and a pioneer in integrating in Mississippi, I want to know what other organization other than the NAACP, what organizations are trying to get publishing companies to include the contribution, because this is how students relate. I've been there for 50 years, and I know that we need to get, what you say, Cheryl, 200,000 colored men in the troops. We need to know that. I asked six children, high school, they did not know that. So how can we get that information? How can we get you in the textbooks?
Craig, you want to take that? You got 30 seconds, and then we got to wrap it up.
You know, I have to be honest with you. I don't know beyond the NAACP or the Congressional Black Caucus who is carrying that torch. What I can say is, from my point of view, the onus is on us to tell our own story.
Exactly.
There's no culture that relies on another culture. You don't see people from China waiting for Americans to tell their story. We have to tell our own story, and it's a by any means necessary thing. And we are in a brave new world, kind of stepping back to the last question. Publishing industry is transforming right before our eyes. And the avenues are there for you, social media, YouTube, the force of your personality and your creativity and your tenaciousness to get the story out there. It really is a thing that comes from within, not from without.
Yeah, but you need it in the regular textbooks, in the regular curriculum. I mean, we have it for African American History Month, sure, but I mean, how can we get it in the regular curriculum? That should not be so difficult.
Well, I think it's a matter of activism. I think it's a matter of, you know, for us to embrace the stories that we love, the stories that we value, the stories that project the image and values that we hold, and to get involved with your school system, to get involved with the decision makers and petition, call, write letters, be tenacious and make it happen.
Okay, I apologize to all. I apologize to all. Wonderful questions. 30 seconds for each of our panelists. Why should people buy your book? Carla, 30 seconds. You just used 5 laughing.
I am a fervent believer that we have to know our history. Somebody this morning, maybe it was Julian Malveaux, said we have to revel in our history. In order to revel in it, we have to know it. People have talked about untold stories, and there are so many untold stories out here, just down the line, untold stories. My family is one of them. They're no different than your family. You can go to the archive, find out your family history. So in that sense, I hope my book is a source of information for you. But as people have been saying, if we don't start getting our stories out, nobody else is going to do it for us. And I'm convinced that once we do get it out, we're not only telling a new African American history, but we'll be telling a new American history.
Wonderful. Dr. Jones, why should people buy your book?
I think the story of Job is something that everyone can relate to today, and I think I expound on all the characteristics we need to maintain in our world today when the floodwaters come, when the hurricanes come, when we fall into that deep landfill and we want to crawl out of it. The story of Job that I've written, that the Lord has put in my heart to bring to the world, is one to encourage and inspire you, that no matter how dark it may appear or it may seem to you, that blessed hope upstairs is going to always be the force by which can bring you through. And I feel the book will be a blessing to you. As my wife and I go across this United States today, people are being blessed, they're being encouraged. And I don't think it's about me. It's what's between the two covers of this book that will encourage and inspire you.
Wonderful. Great.
I've always gravitated to stories of heroes. And heroic stories convey what we think of ourselves, but it also informs the world what to think of us. And it's through stories like John Taylor's, where an individual, through the force of their talent and their character and their tenacity, that's my favorite word today, are able to overcome the challenges and provide an example for others, for future generations, of what's possible under the most extreme circumstances.
Great.
And this is one of those stories.
Thank you, thank you. Dan.
I'm just glad I bought enough money to buy all their books, because I'm sold. Listen, I would just say, even with all of its well-known and well-talked-about flaws, hip-hop is a great American success story. And this book tells the story of how that happened, and it tells the story of the people who made that happen. And they are fascinating stories. They are incredible stories. These are heroes, all of them flawed. But you can discover why they did what they did. Why did Jay-Z, for instance, make the choices that he made? Why do some artists win and some artists lose? That's the story that I tried to tell, but mostly as a great American story.
It is a great American story, Dan. Thank you. And Mark.
My father said to me one day, my high school and college used me, the pros sold me. I was a basketball slave. And I'm sure there's a lot of athletes out here that after they've gone through the gamut and see where they ended up, they look back on their life and see a lot of similarities. And with this book not only talks about the Harlem Globetrotters, not only about my father, but it talks about, again, going through a struggle and being part of an international team that everyone knows about, and ending up, as a matter of fact, one of the other quotes that said, basketball is a game of life, and God is the referee. And that's how he looked at life. Wonderful. And on top of it, I must say this also, most of the stories about our heroes we hear about had to suffer some kind of alcoholism, drug problem, or something like that. My father wasn't that way. He raised 6 kids, and we all stress education.
And you're a testament to that. Thank you, Mark. Let's hear it for our panel. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for your excellent questions. I apologize to whoever I had to cut off, and there'll be a book signing outside next to the Penguin tent. Please support our fabulous authors. Thank you.
The authors on the African American History and Biography panel wrapping up their program from the 2011 Harlem Book Fair. BookTV's live coverage from Harlem will continue after a quick break. with the final panel of the day, a discussion of the first years of the Obama administration. And you are watching BookTV's live coverage of the 13th Annual Harlem Book Fair.
What are you reading this summer? BookTV wants to know.